Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 31. Today we're talking about politics and regional interest in the early 1800s. The theme that we're looking at today is politics and power. We have one learning objective today, and it says, explain how different regional interests affected debates about the role of the federal government in the early republic. The first key concept says regional interest often trumps national concerns as the basis for many political leaders' position on slavery and economic policy. The regions that existed, and the ones that this key concept is referring to, are the Northeast, the Middle Atlantic states, the Southern states, and more broadly, the West. The first area of difference is economic policy. The first economic policy that caused divisions amongst the regions was the tariffs. Tariffs in the time of Alexander Hamilton were being used to raise revenue for the federal government. Now, in 1816, they're being used for the express purpose of protecting domestic industries. Regions with manufacturing are going to benefit from the protection against European competition, and the revenue generated can be used to create infrastructure, roads, and canals for settlements out west. The first tariff of 1816 actually had broad support, even from the South, which is a region that doesn't necessarily benefit from having a tariff because it makes goods more expensive for them. However, the nationalism that was generated as a result of the War of 1812 helped pass this tariff as it was seen as an anti-British policy. The tariff will be raised again in 1828, as seen in the line graph with what is dubbed the Tariff of Abominations. South Carolina opposes the tax and claims that states have the power to nullify federal law if it becomes harmful to the states. There will be more on this in a future lecture that covers Jackson and federal power. In terms of economic policy related to land, that was most important to people who resided in the West. Western settlers and speculators obviously wanted land prices to be cheaper so that they could buy more of it. The Bank of the United States had been a primary lender for some of these land purchases, but at the end of the 1810s, they began to tighten up credit. That means that banks lent less money to people or was more vigilant with whom they lent it to. Sensing an economic downturn, the bank begins to call in some of the loans that were given out, and in the way of a self-fulfilling prophecy, it leads to a financial panic, the Panic of 1819. Speculation, which is buying land in hopes that it will sell for a higher price in the future, was rampant out in the West, and the people who lived out west preferred using local or state banks because they were more willing to lend money than was the Bank of the United States. Anytime speculation was on the rise, the price of land would also go up until buyers realized that they had built a bubble that would result in a crash in the value of the land, and speculators would be unable to repay their loans, which led to bank failures. Slavery is the other big issue that fell within the realm of economic policy that divided the regions. The institution was supported in the South and the new southern states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, since Southerners began to migrate westward with their enslaved workforce. The soil in the East was starting to become exhausted from poor farming techniques over the last 2 centuries, forcing farmers to find more fertile lands in the West. The Northeast had little use for slavery due to the shorter growing seasons and less fertile soil. In the Northwest, slavery had been outlawed when the territory was first organized through the Northwest Ordinance, and it's not going to be an issue that either major political party would take a stance on until 1856. When support for the federal party started to wane, the Democratic-Republican Party would keep the issue out of its platform to avoid a regional fracturing of their support. The issue of slavery will ultimately break up the Democratic Party, which succeeded the Democratic-Republicans into a northern and southern faction. The next key concept says, plans to further unify the U.S. economy, such as the American system, generated debates over whether such policies would benefit agriculture or industry, potentially favoring different sections of the country. Henry Clay is the person who you have to associate with the American system. Henry Clay is going to be a very important figure in the first half of the 1800s. He's going to be involved in a lot of political compromises that shape American politics in the 19th century and often avert greater conflict between states over slavery. He was first elected to the House of Representatives as a war hawk, or someone who supported going to war with Britain in the War of 1812. He quickly is elected to be Speaker of the House and puts forth this new economic program that he calls the American System, and it has 3 steps. The first one is to implement tariffs that are going to protect industries. The revenue from the tariffs are eventually going to be used to fund the third step, the internal improvements. The second step is to have a Bank of the United States that can lend money to businesses and manufacturers to help expand the economy. This was already present in the form of the Second Bank of the United States. It was chartered in 1816 after the First Bank of the U.S. was allowed to expire. Despite the panic in 1819, by the 1820s, the bank was a reliable financial institution. The last step was the construction of internal improvements. This means infrastructure. Anytime that you see the words internal improvements in the 19th century, they're talking about infrastructure, or what we normally think of as infrastructure. That includes roads and other forms of transportation at this time period, like canals and very rudimentary railroads. Anytime that a bill would come up in Congress for internal improvements, it regularly lost, or whenever it passed, it would be vetoed by the president. An example of this is the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was to connect the Hudson River to Lake Erie. It was vetoed by President Monroe after it was passed in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Monroe claimed that it would only benefit the state of New York, and so therefore it wasn't the responsibility of the U.S. government to pay for it. The state of New York ended up funding its construction in the end. This is still an ideological issue between Democratic Republicans and Federalists. Democratic Republicans do not view the federal government's role as being one that should create these internal improvements or forms of infrastructure. The agricultural regions had less to gain, and so they opposed Clay's American system. On the bottom right, a political cartoon criticizes Clay's American system and shows each part of his system as being caged animals stealing food from one another. The last key concept relates to the government's handling of slavery. Congressional attempts at political compromises, such as the Missouri Compromise, only temporarily stemmed growing tensions between opponents and defenders of slavery. The Missouri Territory applies for statehood in 1820 and set the precedent for how the rest of the states formed out of the Louisiana Territory are to be admitted into the Union. After it originally applied for statehood, the House of Representatives member James Talmadge introduces an act of Congress to forbid the institution of slavery as a condition for admittance. It further strains the divisions between North and Southern states over slavery and creates sectionalism. Southern states and Southern representatives were up in arms over the Talmadge Amendment, while Northern representatives are trying to push the anti-slavery measure through. The South was afraid that with another free state represented in the Senate, they would be outnumbered and that abolitionist legislators would try to legislate away slavery. Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives, steps in and brokers a compromise between the two sides. Missouri is admitted as a slave state, and Maine gets carved out of some territory in New England, and that's admitted as a free state. Thus, the balance of representation of free and slave states would be upheld. It set the precedent for the next 30 years in that new states are admitted in pairs so as to avoid that argument again. Another measure that is established is that it sets the northern limit of slavery. Missouri's southern border, the latitude line of 36 degrees and 30 minutes, will be the northern limit for future states that allow slavery. The North are okay with this because it limited the places where slavery could expand into, and the South was okay with it because it guaranteed the institution of slavery could continue. So here's our recap for today. Sectionalism grew over slavery and economic disputes of tariffs, land, and the Bank of the United States. Clay's American system was meant to help develop the U.S. faster, but it was not implemented fully. And finally, the Missouri Compromises temporarily silences discord over the expansion of slavery. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit APUSHslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.